To open, I'd like to read Marie Howe's poem, Annunciation. Even if I don't see it again, nor ever feel it, I know it is, and that if once it hailed me, it ever does. And so it is myself I want to turn in that direction, not as toward a place, but it was a tilting within myself, as one turns a mirror to flash the light to where it isn't. I was blinded like that, and swam in what shone at me, only able to endure it by being no one, and so specifically myself, I thought I'd die from being loved like that. Love is a primary theme in the scriptures, as it should be. Our God is love. But what do we think the opposite of love is? For a long time, I used to think that it was hate. But the scriptures have shown me that it is truly fear that is the opposite of love. When we talk about things that people are afraid of, we often talk about things like spiders, heights, public speaking. Fears are both rational and irrational, but exist because of some perceived threat, whether real or imagined. And while some fears are mostly irrational, some are not. Some are born from deep hurts and wounds. Fear often takes anger and hatred as a mask. We fear those things we do not understand and keep them at a distance, as is fitting for things we assume will cause us harm. Unfortunately, this means that sometimes we keep each other at a distance, afraid and fearful that we will relive our past experiences. Much easier to stay afraid and safe. Our reading in Philippians today is often translated a little differently in other translations. In other versions, verse 12 is translated as, "Work out your faith with fear and trembling." Our reading renders it as great respect. I will come back to great respect in a little bit, so stick a pin into that. Fear and trembling is essentially the literal translation of Paul's word. So why is it that Paul wants to use fear as an image for talking about our faith in God? Why is it that we are supposedly to relate to God with fear? And is this fear the same as the fear that I've been talking about? Or is there something else going on? Unfortunately, I feel the church has somewhat misunderstood Paul and has often tried to get people to obey through the use of fear and terror. People groups would be threatened with eternal damnation if they didn't convert, and of course the church and various kingdoms that professed to be Christian used this to get people to convert both to Christianity and to their way of life. For some people, their parents may have even used threats of God's disappointment or fury to get them to behave. Indeed, there are stories of Indigenous children in residential schools being forced into horrendously terrible situations and being forced to obey under threat of eternal damnation or physical abuse. The fear and trembling translation has often been used to justify this use of fear. Fear, in this sense that I've been speaking of, only leads to separation. So why, when the church, which worships a God of connection and community, why does the church keep using it? Power and control are the easy answers, but I think there is a deeper, more fundamental reason. And it is that I think we find it very difficult to believe that God is not terrifying. Paul's context for writing was as a person living in the Roman Empire, and if you know anything about the Roman Empire, it is that they ruled by fear and terror. Obey the God Emperor and you won't get hurt. Disobey, well, that's a different story. They also struck true to that for the most part. If you assimilated, you probably did fairly well for yourself. This is shown also in the gods that the Romans and Greeks worshipped in the pantheons. They were mostly worshipped out of fear. Don't want to die at sea? Worship Poseidon or Neptune, otherwise he might just decide to flip your ship. Want your marriage to go well? Tell Hera she's amazing. Don't want to get attacked by Aphrodite? Well, don't be pretty. With the pagan gods, it was generally worship and you won't be smote. And the gods didn't really do much for you except just let you live. And this makes sense in a way to them. Thunderstorms are scary enough. But imagine that each time there is a bolt of lightning, it's a vengeful god out of the sky. Imagine that each time a tsunami hits, it's because a god is angry with you. Fear rules all things. It's in everything, the culture, the people. And we take that too. The gods inspired worship by their great acts of violence and power. This kind of holy terror is sometimes attributed to our God. But I think that in general, the scriptures do not portray God as a God who jealously holds on to his authority. Early creation myths often had the gods creating out of violence, the world born out of conflict. Modern video games and media often depict divinity as violent, tyrannical, and petty, because we just assume that anything and everything greater than us must be out to hurt us. Our depictions of advanced civilizations from the stars, UFOs, and everything, they must be malevolent because they are greater than us, and so it must be out to hurt us. We default to fear. We default to hiding, separation, and terror. Keep the divinity satisfied so we don't get smoked. And yet our creeds and prayers as Christians speak of the universe that was not created in crass ways, but with words, with song. Words spoken with authority, certainly, but not tyranny. Matter appeared from the divine simplicity of God's command and took its rightful shape as earth, fish, raven, human. The Israelites are routinely reminded who their God is, not because of his violence or his retribution, but because of his deliverance. The exodus from Egypt is the primary reason given by the prophets for a return to reverence throughout the scriptures. It wasn't, do this or God will smite you, but do this because he has cared for you. Further, Paul writes that one of the primary reasons that all the earth shall bow before Christ is that he hung upon a cross. Jesus, that is, God incarnate, did not see his divinity as a reason to oppress or slaughter his creation, but as a way to serve it. He did not come to earth because he wanted to tell us how bad we were being and how much we deserve pain and death, but how much he loves us. And as he hung bleeding on the cross, he did not denounce us, though we hung him there, but forgave us, saying, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they do. When Jesus died, the earth cracked open and the sky veiled itself in mourning. Creation screamed for its parent, its sculptor having died upon it. This stands in stark contrast to our assumption of God. The church can't help but default to the basic human conception of God, that of the divine tyrant. It feels right. It feels right to be afraid of the king, the Lord, the boss. But our God does not want terror. He doesn't want us quaking in our boots for fear of retribution. The great respect of our translation today comes closer to the conception that Paul was aiming at. His fear and trembling, his great respect. Indeed, John writes that there is no fear in love. If fear is separation and love is the opposite of fear, then love is connection. This weekend, the church and our country reckons with the fear and trauma inflicted upon Indigenous communities. True love can help to bring connection instead of fear. True love is about listening, hearing, embracing the other, not lashing out in fear and telling them that their pain didn't happen because we don't understand, but hearing them, taking responsibility, and moving together forwards to a place of love and connectedness instead of fear and separation. And it is true love that our God showed us when he displayed his magnificence, not by hanging the severed head of the enemy on a spike, but by hanging himself upon a cross. And then, the most magnificent of all, he tells us that death is no more, and walks into true life, glorious. Finally, he rides up into the clouds and sends down upon us torrents of fire and love, that we may know him and each other, that there may be true connectedness. This is fearful and terrifying, not because we await a beating, but because we await a love so bold and open. God opens his arms not just to one nation, but to all. He gives his own body that we may take within ourselves his very being to be nourished. God would not have any of his children perish, and so feeds them, even in death. We work out our faith with fear and trembling and great respect, because the love offered to us is beyond anything that we could experience otherwise. When I stood at the altar before my wife on my wedding day, I trembled with fear, not because I was to be hurt or harmed, but because the love I was to receive was something that I felt I did not deserve. How much more so when we stand before the altar of Almighty God, generously bearing himself upon the table for us. This is why we worship. The God of all things is not a terrifying tyrant, but a lamb who has been whipped as we have been whipped, and wants to love us to the point that we think we may just die of it. And there, only there, can we find life. Thanks be to God.